Sometimes when we are writing the formula of ionic compounds, it could be a bit tricky. So let's look at these given examples over here. We have to be careful to the termination written. So for example, writing the formula of sodium sulfide is different from sodium sulfate or sodium sulfite. Whenever the termination ends with ate or ite, it means that what we have is a complex ionic compound containing a polyatomic ion. Because the polyatomic ions, when we have them in the formula, the name will not change. So let's first explain how to write the formula of sodium sulfide. So since this is an ide, sulfide, it means it's a monoatomic ion. The ide means that I have a monoatomic ion. The monoatomic ion of sulfur. And sulfur belongs to group 16, so it will have a charge of -2. So from the periodic table, we need to write the charge of sodium, which belongs to group 1, and that is +1, and sulfur is 2 minus. Now, remember I explained it in a previous video tutorial that we follow the X rule. So the number 2 that I have over here, number 2 without the minus, I'm gonna take it and write it down next to the Na. And the 1, I will simply ignore it. I don't have to write 1 next to S, it's just S. And after I finish, I erase the charges written as superscript next to the ions. So my final formula is Na2S. Now, whenever I have a termination of ate or ite, it means that we have a polyatomic ion in the formula. Here you need to know the formula of polyatomic ions. If it's given to you in a list or if you memorized it, you must apply it. So again, sodium is the Na+. Now sulfate is the SO4 2 minus, while sulfite is the SO3 2 minus. Now we follow what I previously explained as the X rule. Whatever number you have here, you just place it as a subscript next to the opposite element. And if you have 1, you can simply ignore it. Now when you write your answer, you always must ignore the charges. So my final answer, you must erase them. So my final answer is Na2SO4. And over here, my final answer must be Na2SO3. This X, this plus, I will simply ignore it. And what I mean by ignore it, always have a pencil with you when writing the formula. So after you switch the numbers from superscript to subscript, erase the plus and the minus. Let's look at another example. Magnesium phosphide, magnesium phosphate, and magnesium phosphite. So as I mentioned above, ate and ite represent a polyatomic ion, whereas phosphide, it represents a monoatomic ion, which is the phosphorus that belongs to group 15, having a 3 minus charge. Magnesium belongs to group 2, so it will have a 2 plus charge. So the 2, you will simply take the number and transfer it as a subscript next to the opposite atom, which is P. And the 3, you write it as a subscript next to the Mg. Remember to erase the number and the positive and the negative charge that were written as superscript. So your final answer is Mg3P2. Now, when you have magnesium phosphate or magnesium phosphite, all you need to know is to know the formula of phosphate. Now, phosphate is the PO4 3 minus, while phosphite is the PO3 3 minus, and magnesium will remain as it is, Mg2 plus. Now, following the X rule, the number that you have, the charge that you have, you will write it as a subscript and then you erase it from here along with the minus. Again, this 2, you will write it as a subscript next to the PO4 over here. And you remember to erase the 2 and the plus. Now, in order not to read it as a 42, we always place the PO4 in parentheses. So my final answer is Mg3 PO4. Just can write it closer to it, Mg3 PO4 2. Now, looking at this example, this number 3, remove it from here, transfer it next to the magnesium, and this number 2, remove it and transfer it as a subscript next to the PO3. Now, of course, when you write your final answer, you have to remember to erase the numbers that were written as a superscript. And if there are 2 numbers next to each other, like in here, you put parentheses so that you don't read it as PO32. One last example that I will give: lithium nitride, lithium nitrate, lithium nitrite. As I mentioned, the nitride is simply N, whereas the nitrate is the NO3, 1 minus, and the nitrite is the NO2, 1 minus. Nitride, it belongs to nitrogen, which has a 3 minus charge, and a lithium is Li plus. So, as I mentioned here, the 3 will be transferred next to the Li over here, and you erase it from the side of nitrogen, and the plus you just ignore it. So your formula is Li3N. Now the next example, lithium nitrate or lithium nitrite. Here we look at the charges. Since the charges, they end up to 0, they neutralize each other, the formula of this compound is going to be simply LiNO3. So in this case, you erase the plus, you erase the minus, and you're done. That's it. No numbers to write. Again, here you erase the plus, you erase the minus, and no numbers to write.